The wind howled like a whisper from a ghost, sweeping through the pine forest that surrounded a small cabin nestled deep in the Japanese Alps. Inside, an old man sat frozen in silence, his tea untouched, eyes fixed on the letter clenched in his hand. The ink had bled slightly, as if the words themselves had cried. "You were never my father," the letter read, "only a shadow of one." It was from Sora, the boy he raised as his own. The man, Hiroshi, had known love, loss, and regret, but this betrayal pierced deeper than any before. In one stroke of ink, the illusion of family shattered. The fire in the hearth crackled, indifferent. Time slowed as his breath grew shallow. His world, the only one he had built around devotion, was unmade by a single sentence. Hiroshi whispered, "I gave you everything." But the silence gave nothing back. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, burying what was once whole. Hiroshi had once been a master of the sword. In his youth, his name echoed through Kyoto, not for war, but for peace. He had laid down the blade to raise a boy abandoned in the mountains. That boy, Sora, had been no blood of his, but all of his soul. Hiroshi taught him balance, honor, how to listen to the silence between words. Now, silence was all that remained. The memories came not as warmth but as wounds. The way Sora once laughed, his small feet scampering on temple stones, his voice calling, "Father," these echoes now mocked him. "What did I miss?" Hiroshi murmured. He could still see Sora as a child, gripping a bamboo stick with two hands, mimicking his every motion. The fire in his spirit had been real. But somewhere along the years the fire had cooled. The boy had become a man, and that man had left a wound instead of a goodbye. The world outside the cabin was changing. Snow muffled the mountains but could not quiet Hiroshi's mind. He stepped outside barefoot, into the cold. Each step on the snow was a punishment, a reminder. The sky above was a bruised violet, the last light surrendering to night. He stood still, letting the cold numb his feet, his thoughts, his pain. "Perhaps the pain means I still care," he said aloud. He gazed upward, snowflakes dissolving on his face. The breath he released steamed like a spirit fleeing his body. The world around him, though still, felt as though it was moving on without him. And perhaps it was. For what is a father if not remembered? He knelt down, letting the snow soak through his robe. Still, no answer came from the world or within. Only snow, and the echo of loss. Night deepened, and Hiroshi lit incense on the family altar. The scent of sandalwood curled upward, a thin stream connecting past and present. He placed the letter beside the framed photo of Sora as a child. "If you've burned this bridge," he whispered, "then I will be the ash." The flames flickered, the photo glowing briefly before dimming. Hiroshi poured tea into a second cup, as if expecting Sora to enter and take his seat. But the cup remained untouched, its surface steaming in solitude. Shadows danced on the altar, and in them, Hiroshi saw his failure. Not in what he did, but in what he didn't see. "I never heard your silence," he said. "Only your words. And sometimes, silence is the deepest wound." The snowstorm outside intensified, rattling the wooden walls. But Hiroshi remained still, eyes fixed on the altar. His world had shrunk to this room, this shrine, this grief. He closed his eyes and let the storm speak. Within its howling was something sacred, an invitation to let go. He breathed deeply, and the air felt colder than death. Stillness returned to his limbs, and peace crept in like a thief. "If I can forgive the storm," he thought, "perhaps I can forgive myself." For the first time since reading the letter, his shoulders softened. The pain remained, but so did breath. And as long as he breathed, he could remember, not just the pain, but the love. Not just the silence, but the boy who once called him father. He blew out the candle. Darkness fell. And Hiroshi whispered, "Let the snow cleanse me." In the morning, the storm had passed, but Hiroshi's heart remained in its eye. He moved with the rhythm of routine, boiling rice, folding his futon, sweeping the porch. Yet every action echoed hollow. The forest outside glistened under fresh snow, a deceptive peace masking the unrest within. As he swept, Hiroshi saw Sora's childhood footprints in his memory, running across this very porch, tiny sandals, slapping wood. The past did not just haunt, it walked beside him. The broom stopped mid-motion. A sharp gust of wind hit him, and with it, a realization. Perhaps it wasn't betrayal that shattered him, but the truth it revealed. That his love had always been one-sided. How long, he wondered, did he carry this resentment? The question clung like frost on his breath. In this silence, Hiroshi felt the weight of all the things he had never asked, never known. Sometimes, the storm isn't over. It just changes form. Later, Hiroshi ventured into the woods, drawn to the old shrine they once visited together. Each step was careful, not for fear of falling, but fear of facing. The path was slippery, the way unclear, like his memories. When he arrived, the shrine stood as it always had, untouched, weather-worn, sacred. But it was the offering stone that broke him. There, faint but unmistakable, was a folded piece of cloth. Sora's childhood headband, faded red and frayed at the ends. Hiroshi's knees gave way. "You came back," he whispered. He touched the cloth with trembling fingers. The cloth carried no answers, only proof that Sora had been there. But when? And why leave this behind? Was it a goodbye, an apology, a memory thrown to the wind? Hiroshi closed his eyes, listening for a whisper, a sign, anything. All he heard was the distant cry of a crow, lonely, sharp, final. He sat beneath the shrine's torii gate for hours, watching snow melt from the stone. The wind whispered stories, but none in Sora's voice. The ache had settled into something deeper, a slow burning doubt. Had he raised Sora with love, or with expectation? Had he offered freedom or shaped him into an image? Hiroshi had always believed in silence as a form of wisdom, but now that silence felt like a wall. Perhaps Sora's anger was never spoken because Hiroshi never invited it. "Did I teach you discipline?" he murmured, "but forget compassion?" His words melted into the snow like apologies never spoken. Regret wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was kneeling in a forest where memories returned not as light but as mirrors. And in those mirrors, Hiroshi saw not a villain, but a man who had tried and failed. Returning to the cabin, Hiroshi sat beside the fire and began unrolling old scrolls of Sora's calligraphy. Each stroke carried memory, hesitant, bold, imperfect. Some characters were messy, others stunning. "You always chased perfection," Hiroshi said aloud, "even when I told you peace lies in the flaw." He traced one kanji symbol, mu, emptiness. Sora had drawn it over and over, as if trying to understand it, or perhaps become it. The room grew colder despite the fire. Hiroshi realized he had never asked what mu meant to Sora. He only assumed. The ink, like wounds, had dried long ago, but their meaning was still alive. A symbol meant to liberate had become a chain. Hiroshi stared into the fire and said, "I taught you to be still, but maybe you needed movement." And maybe stillness had been his prison, not Sora's. That night, Hiroshi could not sleep. He stepped outside again, this time not to suffer, but to understand. The moon hung low and full, casting silver across the forest. He stood barefoot once more in the snow. But it felt different now. Not punishment. Ritual. Each breath steamed from him in rhythm. He bowed deeply to the earth, not as a warrior, but as a father stripped of armor. "Sora," he said, "you are not mine to keep." It was the hardest thing he had ever spoken. A whisper released into the cold. He remained bowed for minutes, surrendering, not just to loss, but to truth. That love, real love, must let go. When he stood, the snow beneath his feet had melted, and for the first time in many days, the cold did not bite. It simply was. Like grief. Like healing. The days that followed blurred into one long meditation. Hiroshi ceased speaking, eating little, rising with the sun, and sitting in the stillness he once taught. But it was not peace, it was paralysis. Grief had not loosened its grip, it had only changed masks. He began to hear echoes, not voices but moments, whispers from the past creeping into his mind. Sora's laughter morphed into silence. His joy transformed into accusation. Hiroshi sat by the riverbank one morning, eyes closed, and asked aloud, "Am I meditating or am I hiding?" There was no answer, only the river's endless murmur. The mind, once a sacred place, now felt like a hall of mirrors, where each reflection showed a version of him he no longer trusted. One who had failed. One who had controlled in the name of love. Hiroshi opened his eyes, and for the first time saw not water, but his own reflection staring back in judgment. That night, the dreams returned. Sora, aged somewhere between the child he was and the man he became, stood in the doorway of the cabin. His eyes were clear, voice calm. "Why did you never ask me if I was happy?" he said. Hiroshi tried to speak, but the dream held his tongue. Sora walked around the room, examining the calligraphy, the teacups, the blades still sheathed on the altar. "You created a world where there was no room for me," he continued, placing his hand on the blade. "Only your silence and your rules." Then he vanished, like smoke. Hiroshi awoke drenched in sweat. The candle had burned down to a stub. The room smelled of ash. The blade was still there, untouched. But the question remained, echoing like a bell in a forgotten temple. "Why didn't you ask?" Guilt settled, not like fire, but like stone. The next morning, Hiroshi opened the chest at the foot of his futon. Inside were relics of a life long past, his old sword, letters from his master, and a single drawing Sora had made, a crude sketch of them both, smiling. It was the only smile Hiroshi could now remember. He held the paper as if it might vanish, tracing the stick figures with shaking hands. "This is who we were," he whispered. But memory is a dangerous companion. It can comfort, or it can crush. He remembered the day Sora gave it to him, after their first temple retreat. He had placed it in the chest for safekeeping, never displaying it. Why? Was it pride? Shame? Or fear of sentiment? Now, it felt like a lost opportunity, a frozen act of love left unseen. Hiroshi folded the drawing and placed it on the altar. Perhaps it wasn't too late to see it. He stepped outside with the drawing still in hand and walked to the edge of the cliff that overlooked the valley. Here, he used to bring Sora to watch the stars. Tonight, no stars showed, only a shrouded sky heavy with cloud. Hiroshi held the drawing up to the wind, unsure whether to release it or hold tighter. "Maybe letting go isn't forgetting," he murmured. "Maybe it's remembering differently." The wind tugged at the paper like a child's hand. For a moment, he loosened his grip. But he couldn't let go, not yet. The paper was soaked with memory, with weight. He folded it once more and placed it in the folds of his robe, over his heart. The act felt sacred. Not release, but remembrance. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, I might let go." Sometimes healing doesn't come with fire, but with hesitation. A slow thaw, not a sudden sun. Back at the cabin, Hiroshi lit a single lantern and sat in front of the altar. The flame flickered low, casting long shadows on the walls. He placed the folded drawing beside the incense and picked up the sheathed blade he had not touched in years. Slowly, with reverence, he unsheathed it. The steel gleamed cold and flawless. It was not a weapon. It was a mirror. "You were my path once," he told it. "But I no longer walk that road." He resheathed it and placed it beneath the altar, bowing low until his forehead touched the ground. "Forgive me, Sora, for holding on too tightly, for teaching you how to be strong but not how to be free." As the flame flickered lower, Hiroshi remained in his bow. Not as a warrior, not as a master, just as a man learning how to release without forgetting. A knock echoed through the forest. Not loud, not frantic, but deliberate. Hiroshi froze. The wind paused as if listening to another knock. He moved toward the door with hesitant steps, heart caught between hope and dread. He slid it open and found no one. Only a bundle wrapped in cloth resting on the snow-covered porch. His breath caught. The fabric was old but familiar. It once belonged to Sora's travel pack. With shaking hands, Hiroshi knelt and unwrapped it. Inside lay a journal, thick, leather-bound, worn at the edges. His name was carved on the cover, not master, not father, just Hiroshi. He pressed it to his chest before stepping back inside. Alone again, but not entirely. Something had been left behind. Not a voice, but a key. A path into another soul. Into Sora's. The first pages were rough sketches and travel maps, monasteries, forests, unfamiliar cities. Then, the words began. Sora's handwriting. Slanted, confident, sometimes smudged. I write this not to be read. One entry began, but to remember who I am when no one is watching. Hiroshi read on. The entries spanned years, some angry, some aching, others full of wonder. He teaches silence but fears words. One read. He teaches freedom, but clings to control. And yet, scattered among the pain were fragments of love. He made me tea when I was sick. He stood in the rain until I returned. He never said he loved me, but I felt it. Tears blurred Hiroshi's vision. The truth wasn't that he hadn't been loved. It was that he had never known how to see that love through another's language. The wound deepened, but so did the light. One entry stopped him. It was newer. The ink fresh. I came back last spring. You didn't see me. I left the headband at the shrine. I thought it would free me, but it didn't. I am your son, even if not by blood, and I'm afraid I've become you. Hiroshi's hand trembled. The words were a mirror. Sora had not left out of hate, but fear. Fear of repeating what he had learned. Fear of silence. Fear of becoming the very man who had raised him. I've carried your voice in my head every day, Sora wrote. It shaped me, saved me, and sometimes scarred me. The truth struck like lightning. It had never been about rejection. It was about inheritance. Sora didn't want to escape Hiroshi. He wanted to escape his reflection within. And in doing so, he had left both of them behind. Hiroshi returned to the altar. The journal now rested beside the drawing, the headband placed neatly atop both. He lit a new stick of incense and whispered, "You are my son, even in your absence." The smoke curled upward, weaving into the shadows. He bowed once more, but this time, not in apology, in recognition. Sora had given him something no master could teach, no blade could defend, no meditation could provide: truth. Not as doctrine, but as vulnerability. The kind that breaks. Kind that heals. Hiroshi understood now. His greatest teaching had come from the student he never expected to lose. The altar no longer felt like a shrine to memory. It was now a bridge. A doorway. I hear you now, Hiroshi said, even in silence. And the room, for the first time in days, felt warm. That night, Hiroshi sat beneath the stars. The clouds had lifted. The sky stretched wide, an open scroll inked with constellations. You feared becoming me, he whispered upward. But I was still learning to become myself. He let the silence speak, and in it he felt presence, not as voice or vision, but knowing. The river hummed below, the forest swayed gently. Everything was as it had been, but he was not. A fox darted past. An owl called once. Life continued its rhythm. Hiroshi smiled, faint but honest. He placed a stone at the foot of the cedar tree near the cliff, a quiet marker. Not a gravestone, not an apology, just a point of remembrance. I release you, he said. Not to forget, but to love you without holding. The wind moved gently through the trees. This time, it sounded like Sora's laughter returning. Hiroshi sat once more at the edge of the cliff. This time he brought the blade, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. He unsheathed it slowly, holding it beneath the rising sun. The light caught the steel, and in it he saw his own reflection, and beside it, imagined Sora's. "This no longer defines me," he whispered. Then, with steady breath, he placed the sword flat on the ground before him, aligning it with the horizon. "I am not the silence. I am not the sorrow. I am the space between." His voice cracked, but his hands were steady. He bowed low, forehead to earth, and left the blade behind. As he rose, something within him remained bowed, not out of submission, but reverence. He turned his back on the sword for the first time in decades, walking down the path not as a warrior, but as a father, and more importantly, as a man reclaimed. Hiroshi descended into the valley, visiting the village temple he had not stepped inside since Sora's departure. The monks greeted him with bowed heads, but silence lingered between them like an old wound. In the garden he stood before a massive bell he once rang with Sora as a child. Its surface was rusted now, vine-covered. "It no longer sings," a monk said gently. Hiroshi ran his fingers across the bronze surface. "Then perhaps it is time." With the monk's help, he cleaned the bell, uncovering etched sutras long buried beneath moss and time. When the moment came, Hiroshi grasped the wooden mallet. He closed his eyes, summoned every unspoken word, and struck. The bell rang out, low and deep, resonating through the valley like a call to the soul. For the first time, Hiroshi wasn't waiting for an echo. The sound itself was enough. Inside the temple, Hiroshi lit incense not for prayer, but for presence. He sat before a statue of Kannon, the bodhisattva of compassion, and whispered, "Teach me how to forgive what did not ask to be forgiven." His voice did not echo. It landed gently in the still air, like a leaf on water. He stayed motionless, letting the smoke rise between them. Not as offering, as surrender. He recalled a line his master once said, "Enlightenment is not escape, but engagement." And Hiroshi had fled for years, behind teachings, behind discipline, behind love he did not know how to express. Now, with hands pressed together, he offered no answers. Only stillness. And for the first time, that stillness felt like home. He didn't cry. He didn't chant. He simply breathed. One breath for Sora. One breath for himself. One breath to begin again. On the walk back to the cabin, Hiroshi passed a sakura tree, blooming unseasonably in the snow. The contrast startled him. Delicate pink petals scattered across the white ground, fragile and bold. He paused, reaching out to touch a branch. It reminded him of Sora, soft where Hiroshi had been hard, expressive where he had been silent. The world was full of such contradictions, yet both snow and blossom shared the same branch, the same breath. "You were never meant to become me," Hiroshi said aloud. "You were always meant to bloom where I could not." The wind lifted the petals, carrying them across his path. He stood watching, eyes wide, not in sorrow, but in awe. Life, he realized, is not measured by what we pass down, but what we allow to grow. And for once, he felt proud, not of the man he had raised, but of the man he had released. Back at the cabin, Hiroshi stood before the mirror. Not the polished blade, but a real mirror, long hidden beneath cloth. He unveiled it slowly. His reflection greeted him like a stranger and an old friend. Time had carved his face, but now he saw more than lines. He saw the man he had become through trial, error, love, and loss. "This is who you are," he said, voice calm. "Not master, not father, just Hiroshi." He smiled faintly. "Not forced, not performative, just enough." He placed a hand on the mirror, and in that reflection saw not only himself, but Sora too, as he had once been. Then, like light through paper walls, the past and present blurred, and in that merging, Hiroshi found peace. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it was now part of him. Not an enemy, not a weight, but a truth finally embraced. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted in thin rivers down the mountain slopes, revealing stone, soil, and forgotten pathways. Hiroshi stood beneath the cedar near the cliff, where he had once placed the stone for Sora. The earth had shifted, but the stone remained. He crouched beside it and planted a single seed, a sakura tree. "I do not plant this for remembrance," he said, pressing soil over the seed. "I plant it for continuation." His hands, old and scarred, moved with care. He did not expect to see it bloom. That wasn't the point. It was enough to know that life would carry forward, unattached to him, yet forever shaped by him. As he rose, a breeze passed through, carrying with it no voice, no sign. Just the wind. And that was enough. Not all endings come with answers. Some come with invitations. The cabin had changed. Not in appearance but in atmosphere. Where once it echoed with absence, it now breathed in rhythm with Hiroshi's quieter, fuller self. He rearranged the altar, not to mourn, but to honor. The blade remained beneath it, but it no longer weighed heavy. The drawing sat framed. The journal rested beside it. And beside both, a new addition, a brush and inkstone. Hiroshi had begun writing. Not doctrine. Not teachings. Just moments. Feelings. Questions without answers. He didn't try to create perfection. He let his thoughts flow like the river. Some days, the ink barely moved. Others, it poured like rain. It was not about mastery. It was about movement. "I was once a teacher," he said, dipping the brush again, "but now I am simply learning how to be." And in that, he found something better than peace. He found presence. One morning, as cherry blossoms began to bud along the trail, Hiroshi stepped out carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside the small altar stone near the cedar tree. No words were spoken. It was not a ritual, just an act of kindness extended across time. He sat on a flat stone nearby and sipped slowly. The wind moved the blossoms like whispers in the air. In that moment, he imagined Sora beside him, not as a boy, not as a ghost, but as a man, sitting in silence. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In his mind, Hiroshi turned and smiled at his son. And in the stillness he felt it, Sora smiling back. Not in forgiveness. Not in farewell. But in understanding. Some presences never leave. They simply soften into the wind, the leaves, and the space between breaths. Days passed with gentle rhythm. Hiroshi tended the garden, swept the porch, bowed to the morning sun. But something within him had shifted. There was no urgency, no expectation. Only attention. The world hadn't changed. He had. A neighbor from the village came one afternoon. An old student, long unseen. "Sensei," he said, bowing deeply. Hiroshi returned the bow. "No longer sensei," he replied softly. "Just Hiroshi." The younger man hesitated, then smiled. "Then teach me how to be just." They laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a knowing one, shared between 2 souls aware of their imperfection. Hiroshi invited him in, poured tea, and said nothing more. For now, the lesson was in presence. In sitting. In steam rising from a cup. Not all wisdom must be spoken. Some must be shared in silence. That evening, Hiroshi stood outside the cabin as dusk settled in soft violet hues. The trees swayed, not with drama, but with rhythm. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and exhaled all that had clung to him. He did not erase the past. He embraced it, layer by layer, breath by breath. The pain was still there, but now it sang alongside the peace. A harmony born not of resolution, but of inclusion. The wind brushed his sleeve gently, and for a fleeting second he could have sworn he heard Sora's voice. Not calling, not crying, just being. Hiroshi opened his eyes. The world was exactly as it had been, and yet entirely new. He stepped back inside without a word, and the door slid shut behind him. Not as an ending, as a continuation. Tomorrow would come. And for the first time he would greet it, not with grief, but with grace. Morning dew clung to the steps of the porch as Hiroshi stepped out with his brush and ink. A fresh parchment awaited his thoughts. But he didn't rush. He watched the clouds drift across the sky, felt the weight of the brush in his hand, the steadiness of breath in his chest. He was no longer chasing healing. It had settled into him, quiet and firm like a tree's roots. He dipped the brush slowly, mind still, heart open. He did not write a lesson. He wrote a truth. Love is not control, it is surrender without disappearance. The ink dried with purpose. He placed the parchment beside the others, then brewed tea. He no longer needed the past to change. He had changed in how he carried it. That was enough. A breeze passed through, rustling the paper like a soft applause. Life did not need him to be perfect. It simply needed him to be present. That afternoon, Hiroshi visited the shrine once more. The sakura seed he had planted had begun to sprout, tiny green shoots reaching toward the sky. He knelt beside it and smiled. Not because it had grown, but because it had begun. Growth was not measured in height, but in willingness to reach. He poured a ladle of water from the spring and nourished the soil. This is your legacy, he whispered. Not the blade, not the teachings, but this. A sprout. A beginning. A silent promise that pain could become something else. Something soft. Something sacred. Behind him, the wind rustled the trees as if in agreement. Hiroshi closed his eyes and touched the soil, grounding himself in this moment, this act. Legacy, he now understood, was not what we leave behind. It was what we choose to water while we're still here. The cabin door remained open that evening. A gentle invitation to whatever the world might bring. Birds perched on the sill. A fox watched from the edge of the woods. Oh. Nature no longer felt like something apart from him, but something he belonged to. He brewed a second cup of tea and placed it across from him. No one came. And yet, he wasn't alone. He drank slowly, one sip at a time, and listened, not for voices, not for signs, but for the quiet rhythm of the moment. Presence, he said aloud, requires no witness. His words hung in the air, light as the steam from his cup. This was peace. Not the absence of longing, but the wholeness that remains after longing softens. He closed his eyes. The air around him stilled. It was enough. And that word, enough, had become his salvation. The next morning brought no grand change. And yet, Hiroshi awoke lighter. He stepped outside to find the world exactly as it had been. Mountains, trees, wind. But he saw it differently. Not as a man broken. Not as a master clinging to discipline. But as someone finally able to be held by the world, not just hold it. He took a deep breath and whispered, I am ready. Ready for what he didn't know. Perhaps to live without needing to define it. He walked down the trail he had once feared, each step not toward escape, but into the unknown, arms open. The sun rose behind him, casting long golden shadows ahead. He did not look back. Not because he had forgotten, but because everything he needed now walked with him, in memory, in forgiveness, and in peace. The future didn't scare him anymore. It welcomed him. As the sky warmed into full day, Hiroshi stopped at the edge of the ridge, one final time. Below him, the valley stretched in soft colors, green, gold, and pink. A bird soared overhead, effortless. He breathed in deeply and smiled, not at a memory, not at a revelation, but simply because he could. In that moment, there were no more questions, no more echoes. Just the breeze, the breath, and the becoming. The world did not demand anything from him. It only invited. And he accepted. Then, with one last look at the vastness before him, he whispered a single truth. A line he had waited a lifetime to understand, and now spoke without trembling. I am no longer waiting to be whole. I already am. The wind answered not in words but in stillness. And for the first time, Hiroshi's story did not end. It simply dissolved, like snow, into spring.